Most people in Britain have tasted Cadbury. Fewer know that its fortune was built on a single word, printed on every tin, promising the public something no rival could match. That word was pure. The firm that sold it was Quaker, and its owners came from the family whose faith had helped to end slavery across the empire. They housed their workers in a garden village with no public house, no slum, and no want. And for 8 years, while that village was studied and admired across the world, roughly half of the cocoa that made the chocolate came from 2 small islands where the people who grew it had been marched to the sea in chains, and where, by the counts of the men who went to sea, close to 1 in 5 of them died every year. This is the story of how the purest name in Britain learned what its sweetness stood on. If you are drawn to the stories the comfortable histories leave out, subscribe and stay with this one to the end, because the reckoning in it is stranger than any invention, and it arrives in a place you will not expect. Chapter 1. A shopkeeper who would not sell drink. In the year 1824, a young Quaker opened a grocer's shop in Birmingham and ground cocoa by hand behind the counter. His name was John Cadbury. He was the son of a Quaker draper named Richard Tapper Cadbury, and the shop he took stood at number 93 Bull Street, next door to his father's premises, in a city that was fast becoming the workshop of the world. He sold tea and coffee, and hops and mustard, and beside them, as a sideline that few would have marked at the time, he sold cocoa and drinking chocolate that he prepared himself with a mortar and a pestle, a thick and gritty drink for those who could afford it. He had been raised to trade and trained to it. As a boy, he had gone to a Quaker school, and as a young man, he had served an apprenticeship with a tea dealer in Leeds, learning the handling of leaf and bean before he ever kept a shop of his own. When he came back to Birmingham and opened his door, he opened it with his father's backing and his father's name behind him. And that name meant something in the city, for the Cadburys were known as careful, sober, honest people, the kind who paid what they owed and asked a fair price and no more. That trust was no small thing in the commerce of the age. It was the era of the swindler and the sham, of patent medicines that cured nothing, and grocers who weighed their thumbs along with the tea. A name that could be relied on was worth real money, and the Quaker names could be relied on, because a friend who cheated a customer answered for it to his meeting as well as to his conscience. When a housewife saw a Quaker name above a shop or upon a tin, she read into it honesty, sobriety, and fair dealing, and she was seldom disappointed. John Cadbury inherited that reputation from his faith and his father, and he spent his life adding to it rather than drawing it down. To understand why a grocer of that faith reached for cocoa at all, look at the walls that surrounded a Quaker in that age. The Society of Friends stood outside the established church, and the law had long treated its members as outsiders. They were barred from the old universities, from Parliament, from the army, from much of the professional life that a clever and ambitious young man might otherwise have entered. The doors that led into the gentleman's world were closed to them. What remained open was trade. And so, generation after generation, Quaker families poured their talent into business, into banking and iron and shipping and food, and earned along the way a reputation that was itself a kind of capital. A Quaker firm was known for fixed and honest prices, for plain dealing, for paying its debts. People trusted the name on the door before they had tasted anything inside. Cocoa, in particular, drew the Quaker families in, until 3 of them came to rule the trade between them. There was Fry of Bristol, oldest of the 3, making chocolate since the 1750s. There was Rowntree of York, and there was Cadbury of Birmingham. They were rivals in the market and friends in the meeting house, intermarried and interknown, and a young Cadbury might learn his trade in a rowan-tree works and think nothing strange in it. George Cadbury, John's son, would do exactly that, serving part of his own training under Joseph Rowntree in York. The chocolate trade of Victorian Britain was, to a remarkable degree, a family business shared among a single faith. There was a second reason John Cadbury reached for cocoa, and it ran deeper than commerce. He was a temperance man, and he remained one for the whole of his long life, a lifelong total abstainer, and in time a vice president of the great national temperance body of the age. He looked at the Birmingham around him, and he saw what cheap gin did to the poor, the wages drunk away, the families broken, the misery that rose out of the bottle. To a man of his convictions, cocoa was not merely a product, it was an answer. Here was a warm and nourishing drink that could stand in the place of alcohol, a comfort at the end of a working day that left a man clear-headed in the morning. Cocoa also had to be made with water that had first been boiled, which in a filthy city made it safer than much of what came from the pump. Selling it was, in his mind, a small act of reform. He was doing good and doing business in the same motion, and he would have seen no contradiction in that at all. The shop did well enough that within a few years the sideline had outgrown the counter. In 1831, he rented a warehouse and began to manufacture in earnest, no longer merely grinding cocoa to sell across his own counter, but making it in quantity to sell to others. A catalogue from the early years listed 16 kinds of drinking chocolate and 11 kinds of cocoa, a range that speaks of ambition well beyond a single grocer's shop. His brother Benjamin joined him, and the firm took the name Cadbury Brothers and moved to larger premises on Bridge Street and opened an office in London. In 1854, it received a royal warrant as maker of cocoa and chocolate to Queen Victoria, the first of the marks of establishment approval that would gather around the name over the coming century. And yet none of this yet made an empire. It made a respectable Birmingham manufacturer, one of many, in a trade crowded with competitors and undercut at every turn by cheaper and dirtier rivals. John Cadbury was aging, his health failing, his energy for the daily fight running down. His wife had died, and grief and rheumatism had worn him low. The business he had built with such conviction was beginning, quietly, to slip, its workforce shrinking, its books turning from black to red. The question that hung over the firm as the 1850s closed was not how a hand-ground sideline would become a household name. It was whether the name would survive at all. Chapter 2. The word that saved a failing firm. By 1861, the business was dying, down to a handful of workers and losing money, and two brothers inherited the wreck. Their names were Richard and George Cadbury, the sons of John, and when they took the firm from their father's failing hands, it employed only about a dozen people and was sliding toward collapse. George was then in his early 20s and Richard a little older. They were young men handed a sinking thing, and the sensible course, the course their friends urged on them, was to let it go and find safer work. They chose instead to fight for it. The early years of that fight were bleak. The brothers ran the firm with a severity bordering on hardship, cutting every cost, taking almost nothing out for themselves. George would later say that in those days he would have been content with a profit of £1,000 a year, a modest hope for a business that would one day be counted among the largest in the country. To keep the doors open, he drew on family money, some £4,000 of his mother's inheritance, and watched it drain away into a business that for a long time gave nothing back. There were mornings when the failure of the whole enterprise seemed only weeks away. An early product they pinned hopes on, a cocoa blended with moss, failed in the market and was quietly dropped. The firm was running out of both money and ideas. The gamble on the Dutch press was, in truth, the firm's last throw. Money was short and patience shorter, and had the essence failed, there would likely have been no second chance. But it did not fail. It arrived at the exact moment the public was learning to fear what lay hidden in its food, and it offered the one thing the frightened buyer wanted, which was certainty. Here was a cocoa a person could trust without knowing any chemistry at all, because the maker staked its whole name on the single claim of purity. The timing was fortunate, and the brothers had the wit to seize it, and the essence did more than sell. It rescued the firm, and set the pattern of everything that followed, a business that would rise or fall on whether the public believed its word. What saved them was not effort alone. It was an idea, and the idea arrived from Holland. A Dutch maker named Van Houten had, decades earlier, invented a press that did something the old methods could not. It squeezed the fat, the cocoa butter, out of the roasted bean under great pressure, and what was left could be ground into a fine and pure powder that dissolved cleanly and digested easily. In the year 1866, George Cadbury travelled to the continent, studied the machine, and brought the method home. Cadbury was the first British firm to take it up at scale, and from it came a new product that the brothers launched that same year. They called it Cadbury's Cocoa Essence, and they sold it under a promise of 3 words that would prove worth more than any factory. Absolutely pure, therefore best. To see why those 3 words were a weapon, look at the trade they were aimed at. Victorian cocoa was very often a fraud in a tin. The raw bean was so rich in fat that it needed something to absorb the grease, and the cheaper makers reached for whatever came to hand. They bulked their cocoa out with potato starch and ground flour. They coloured it, in the worst cases, with brick dust. The medical journal The Lancet ran a long investigation into the adulteration of food, led by a physician named Arthur Hassel. And when its analysts tested chocolate, they found that of around 70 samples, more than half carried added colouring or foreign matter that had no business being there. The scandal helped drive a run of new laws against the adulteration of food across the 1860s and 70s. And into that suspicious market, Cadbury walked with a cocoa that needed no filler at all, because the press had already taken out the fat that the fillers were there to hide. The purity was not a slogan bolted on afterward. It was the plain truth of the product, and it was also the whole argument for buying it. A mother spooning Cadbury's essence into a cup for her children could believe she was giving them something clean in an age when so much food was quietly poisoned. Doctors could recommend it without qualm. The essence sold, and it sold not on cheapness, but on trust. And trust, once won, is the most durable thing a business can own. The brothers understood, too, that a product had to be more than good. It had to be felt. Richard Cadbury had an eye for beauty and a gift for presentation, and it was he who, in the late 1860s, began to decorate the firm's chocolate boxes with painted scenes, and to make the ornamental box a thing worth keeping in itself, the beginning of the association between chocolate and affection that endures to this day. Where George drove the works and the buying, Richard shaped the face the firm showed to the public. Between them, they had product and image both, and the two rose together. The essence carried the firm up out of the danger it had been in, and set it on the long climb that would define the rest of the century. The brothers had found the thing every great business needs, a reason for the customer to choose them that the customer could feel was also right. Purity made Cadbury money, and it made Cadbury respected, and the two things were, for the moment, the same thing. Neither brother could have guessed that the very word which lifted the firm would one day be turned against it in a courtroom, and that the question of what pure really meant would come to hang over everything they had built. Chapter 3. The most trusted name in Britain. In 1897, Cadbury passed its old Quaker rival Fry to become the largest chocolate maker in the country. It was a milestone that would have seemed impossible 30 years earlier, when the firm was a dozen workers and a borrowed inheritance. Now it was the leader of a whole industry, and the leadership rested on the reputation the essence had won. Fry of Bristol was older, another of the great Quaker chocolate houses, and for decades it had stood first. Cadbury overtook it not by cutting prices, but by holding to the quality and the purity that had become the meaning of the name. The growth showed in the numbers of people the firm now fed and employed. By the closing years of the century, Cadbury Brothers had grown from that early dozen to a workforce of around 2,600, and it was still climbing. The little works had become a great one, its output now on a great industrial scale, its products carried by rail to every corner of Britain and by ship out across the empire, to the settlers and soldiers and administrators who wanted a taste of home. In the year 1899, the same year that Richard Cadbury died suddenly while travelling abroad, the firm became a limited company, its ownership held within the family, its scale now industrial in the full sense of the word. The little Bull Street sideline had become one of the commercial powers of the Midlands. The numbers tell the scale of it. From a dozen workers in 1861, the firm had grown past 2,600 by the end of the century, and it would grow into many thousands more in the years that followed. Its cocoa and chocolate left Bourneville by the trainload, carried to every county in Britain, and shipped to the far edges of the empire, to the settlers and soldiers and administrators who wanted a taste of home. The custom of a few had become the custom of millions of ordinary households. In little more than a generation, a failing grocer's sideline had grown into one of the largest food manufacturers in the country, and by some way, the largest maker of chocolate in it. Around the name gathered every kind of approval a business could hope for. There was the royal warrant, first granted by Queen Victoria back in 1854, a mark of standing that the firm carried with pride and renewed under later monarchs. There was the trust of the medical world and the household. And there was the sheer familiarity of the thing, the way a Cadbury tin on a kitchen shelf had become an ordinary feature of respectable British life. When people thought of Cadbury, they thought of purity, of quality, and of a certain decency that seemed to belong to the whole enterprise. It was not only that the chocolate was good, it was that the firm behind it seemed good. And in an age suspicious of the new industrial fortunes and the hard men who made them, that was rare and valuable. For this was the peculiar achievement of the Cadburys, and the thing that makes their story matter. Other men grew rich in Victorian Britain, richer than they, on coal and cotton and iron, and the public looked on those fortunes with envy or suspicion or fear. The Cadbury fortune was looked on with something closer to approval. Here, people felt, was wealth honestly made and decently used, a business that seemed to prove that a man could prosper without preying on anyone, that commerce and conscience could keep the same house. It was a comforting belief, and the firm did much to earn it, and the more it earned it, the more valuable that belief became, until the good name was itself among the firm's largest assets, worth more than any factory or warehouse it owned. Then, in the year 1905, came the product that would carry the name deepest into the century and furthest into memory. It was a bar of milk chocolate, smoother and sweeter than anything the firm had made before, and it was called dairy milk. For most people alive today, that bar is the first thing the word Cadbury brings to mind. The bar came late. The reputation this story depends upon was already built and secure before dairy milk existed, built on the pure cocoa of 1866, and on everything the firm had made of it in the 40 years since. The empire was not founded on indulgence. It was founded on trust. By the opening of the new century, then, Cadbury stood at a height few businesses ever reach. It was the largest in its trade, admired as much for its conduct as for its products, a name that meant something clean in a dirty age. It had money, standing, and the affection of the public, and it was about to translate all three into something visible on the ground, a place that would carry its values into brick and garden and become, for a generation of reformers, the proof that industry itself could be redeemed. That place was already rising in the fields south of Birmingham, and to see how far the firm would later fall, it is necessary first to walk through the height of what it built. Chapter 4. A factory built in a garden. In 1879, the brothers moved production out of the smoke of Birmingham to a green field they named Bourneville. The old works on Bridge Street in the city had grown cramped and grimy, hemmed in by the industrial sprawl, with no room to expand and no air worth breathing. George Cadbury, in particular, had come to loathe what the modern town did to the people who lived in it. He had spent years of his early mornings teaching in an adult school in the poorest quarters of Birmingham before the working day began, and he had seen the courts and the back-to-back houses, the foul air and the drink and the early deaths. When the moment came to build a new factory, he built it as far from all that as he could, on some 14 acres of open country 4 miles to the south, beside a small river called the Bourne, near a place then known as Bournebrook. The name they chose tells its own story. They took the river, the Bourne, and added to it a French-sounding ending, ville, because chocolate in that age carried a certain continental glamour, and the name would flatter the product. Bourneville. It sounded like somewhere in France, and it stood in the English Midlands, a factory set down in fields with room to breathe around it. George Cadbury called his ambition a factory in a garden, and he meant it almost literally. There would be lawns and playing fields, light and air, trees and space, everything the crowded city denied. Around 16 houses for workers went up near the new works at the start, the first seeds of something much larger, and the men and women who came out from the city to work there found themselves, for the first time in their lives, labouring in the open country. The difference between Bourneville and the ordinary industrial world was not only a matter of cleaner air, it was a matter of intention. A Victorian factory was, as a rule, a machine for extracting labour, and the town that grew around it grew by accident, thrown up cheap and close by landlords who cared nothing for the tenants and everything for the rent. What George Cadbury proposed was the opposite. He would shape the place around the people, not the people around the place. He would prove, on the ground and in brick, that a workforce housed well and treated well would be a better and a steadier workforce, and that a manufacturer could do this and still prosper. It was a wager against the whole logic of the age, and he had the fortune from the pure cocoa to make it. He backed that wager with care over the smallest things. The working conditions inside the new factory ran ahead of the law and ahead of the trade. There were gardens for the workers to walk in, and separate provision for the men and the women, and rules against the casual cruelties that were common elsewhere. The firm looked to the health of its people, and kept records, and acted on them. To a young woman leaving school in Birmingham, a place at Cadbury was a prize worth having, cleaner and kinder, and more secure than the mills and workshops that were the usual fate, and families competed to place their daughters there. The firm could choose its workers, and it chose well, and the loyalty it built repaid it many times over. And there was method in the kindness, not charity alone. George Cadbury had reasoned, and then proved, that people who were rested and healthy and content did better work than people who were exhausted and ill, that low wages paid in misery were dear at the price, and that a firm which looked after its workers would be repaid in skill and steadiness and long service. What looked to some rivals like soft-heartedness was, in his hands, also hard sense, and the profits that flowed from Bournville quietened the doubters. The garden did more than adorn the firm's wealth. It helped to create it. And that union of conscience and profit, so comfortable and so complete, is the very thing the second half of this story will break apart. There is a deeper contrast worth holding on to here, because the whole of this story turns on it. Bournville was a place designed to be seen. It was meant to be visited, admired, studied, held up as an example. And in time it would be all of those things, drawing reformers and planners from across Britain and beyond who came to walk its streets and copy its ideas. It was industry with the doors thrown open, industry proud of itself, industry that wished to be looked at. Somewhere on the far side of that pride, at the other end of the chain that fed the factory, lay places built on precisely the opposite principle. Places designed never to be seen at all. Compounds on two distant islands, where the cocoa began its journey, and where no admiring visitor from Birmingham would ever set foot. The same firm stood at both ends of that chain. It is the distance between those two kinds of place, the one built for the eye and the one built to escape it, that this film exists to close. Through the 1880s, the new works flourished in its garden. The business grew, the essence sold, dairy milk was still years off, and George Cadbury turned his mind to the next and greater part of the design. The factory was only the beginning. What he wanted now was not merely a clean place to work, but a whole place to live. A village that would answer the slums he had spent his youth among, built to his own principles and protected forever from the speculators who ruined everything they touched. In the year 1893, he began to buy the land. And what he built upon it would become the most famous experiment of its kind in the world. Chapter 5. The Village with No Public House. There was no public house anywhere in Bournville, for the estate was dry on principle, and pilgrims crossed Europe to study it. That single absence, a working village with nowhere to buy a drink, tells you almost everything about the mind that made it. George Cadbury had watched alcohol hollow out the poor of Birmingham, and when he built a place of his own, he built the temptation out of it entirely. No brewer, no publican, no gin palace on the corner. In its place he put gardens. It was a decision that some thought sentimental and some thought tyrannical, and that he thought simply right, and he held to it, so that for the greater part of a century, a resident of Bournville who wanted a glass of beer had to leave the village to find one. From 1893 onward, the land he had bought filled with houses, and they were houses of a kind that working families in that age simply did not get. He began with around 120 acres and added to it year by year. The houses were built in an easy cottage style, many of them by a young architect named William Alexander Harvey, each one set apart with light on every side, low and warm and solid. And every house had a garden, a real garden, large enough to grow vegetables and keep fruit trees, and the fruit trees were planted before the tenants even arrived, so that the ground would be productive from the first season. By the middle of the 1890s, well over 100 cottages stood on the estate, and by the turn of the century, more than 300 houses spread across some 330 acres, and the building went on. To a family come from a back-to-back in the city, where a dozen households shared a yard and a single privy, and the air was thick with soot, a Bournville cottage with its own garden must have seemed like a different country. But the village was more than bricks and gardens. It was a whole apparatus of care, and it ran far ahead of anything the law required. There were schools, there were parks and open recreation grounds, and playing fields where the works teams played their cricket and their football, and in time a great pavilion and grounds for swimming and boating. There were pension arrangements for the old and medical and dental provision for the sick, at a time when a serious illness could ruin a working family outright. There were committees, separate ones for the men and the women, through which the employees could raise complaints and put forward ideas, a small share of voice in the place where they spent their days. George Cadbury founded and funded adult education, buying a house that became a college where working people and, in time, students from across the world could study. Taken together, it amounted to something the world would later learn to call welfare, decades before the state would take up the work. Set the scale of it against the ordinary lot of the Victorian poor, and the achievement stands out sharp. The common industrial worker of that age had no pension, no sick pay, no paid doctor, no garden, no committee, no voice, and no security of any kind against the day when age or injury ended his usefulness. He lived where he could afford to live, which was in the worst housing the market offered, and when he could no longer work, he fell back on his family, or on charity, or on the workhouse. Against that background, a place that offered a cottage and a garden and a pension and a school and a clinic was not a small improvement. It was a different order of life, and the men who studied it understood that they were looking at a glimpse of a possible future. That was the paradox the visitors carried home. Here was proof that the grinding poverty of the industrial town was a choice and not a law of nature, that an employer who wished to could house his people decently and still prosper, and that the misery elsewhere was therefore, in some measure, the work of employers who did not wish to. Bournville was a rebuke as much as an example. It shamed the slum landlord and the sweating master simply by existing, and that quiet reproach was a part of why it was so widely praised and so closely studied, and why the name of Cadbury came to stand, in the public mind, for the conscience of British industry itself. And in the year 1900, George Cadbury did the thing that set the seal on all of it. He gave the village away. He took the estate out of his own hands and out of the reach of his heirs and placed it in a new and independent body, the Bournville Village Trust, established for the express purpose of governing the place and preventing anyone ever from making a private profit out of it. He had built a model village and then made sure that no one could exploit it, not even his own family, not even himself. His wife, Elizabeth, would carry the work on for decades after his death. It was as pure a piece of philanthropy as the age produced, and the world took note. For that is the thing about Bournville. It did not stay a private kindness. It became a public argument. Reformers and planners and officials came from across Britain and from the continent, and from further still to walk its streets, to measure its houses, to study how a factory owner had housed his people, and to carry the lesson home. Bournville was written up and photographed and praised, held out as living proof that the industrial system did not have to grind people down, that a business could be humane and prosperous at once. Every visitor who left impressed added a little more to the moral capital of the Cadbury name, until that capital was among the greatest any firm in Britain possessed. The chocolate was pure. The village was good. The family was Quaker. It all hung together, seamless and admired, a reputation that seemed unassailable. And it is precisely because that reputation was so high, so carefully built, and so widely believed, that what came later cut so deep. A firm with an ordinary name has an ordinary fall. A firm that has made itself the very symbol of decency has further to drop. And every one of its virtues, when the reckoning comes, can be turned into a measure of its hypocrisy. Chapter 6. The family whose faith fought slavery. The Cadburys were heirs to the Quakers, who had stood at the very front of the fight to abolish slavery for more than a century. This is not decoration to the story. It is the beam the whole thing hangs from. because the deepest charge against Cadbury was never simply that a business bought cheap cocoa. It was that this business, of all businesses, born of this faith, of all faiths, should have known better and moved faster, and that the sin, when it came, would be measured against a conscience the family itself claimed to own. What was that conscience made of? The Society of Friends had been among the earliest voices anywhere in the English-speaking world to say plainly that one human being could not rightly own another. As far back as the 1680s, Quakers in the American colonies set down a formal protest against the holding of slaves, one of the first such documents of its kind. Through the 1700s, the society moved, meeting by meeting, toward making slave trading a thing no member could do and remain in good standing, until by the 1760s, the London Yearly Meeting had formally condemned the trade. In 1783, Quakers carried the first great petition against the slave trade to the British Parliament. 4 years later, when the famous committee was formed to bring about abolition, the great majority of its founding members were Friends. They filled the committees, funded the work, gathered the evidence, and kept the cause alive through the long years when it seemed hopeless. Their labour bore fruit that changed the world. The British slave trade was abolished in the year 1807. Slavery itself was abolished across the British Empire in the 1830s. These were among the great moral victories of the age, and at every stage of the long struggle that produced them, the plain-dressed men and women of the Society of Friends had been in the front rank, out of all proportion to their small numbers. The teaching beneath that record was simple and radical at once. Friends held that there was that of God in every person, without exception, in the poorest labourer as surely as in the greatest lord, in the African as surely as in the Englishman. From that single conviction, the whole Quaker war on slavery had flowed, for a people who are each a vessel of the divine cannot rightly be bought and sold as cattle. It was a belief the Cadburys were raised in and lived by, in their politics and their giving and their care for their own workers. And it was a belief that would turn what was coming into something worse than a scandal. It would make it a self-betrayal. To be a Quaker in 19th century Britain was to belong to the people who had helped to end slavery, and to know it. The Cadburys inherited that history the way a family inherits a name. It was simply part of who they understood themselves to be. Their faith taught that there was that of God in every person, in the labourer as much as the master, in the African as much as the Englishman, and from that teaching the whole Quaker war on slavery had flowed. John Cadbury had been a reformer of the ordinary kind, active against the use of small boys as chimney sweeps and against cruelty to animals. George Cadbury poured his fortune into the housing and schooling and healing of the poor, and into the liberal politics of reform. The moral seriousness was real, not a pose, and it reached back through the generations to that founding stand against human bondage. When a British family of this faith looked upon the institution of slavery, they were supposed to see the very thing their forebears had given their lives to destroy. Hold that image steady, because the film is about to move to its second half, and everything that follows must be measured against it. Here is a family whose religion helped to end slavery in the British Empire. Here is a firm that built its fortune on purity and its reputation on decency, that housed its workers in gardens and gave its model village away so that none could profit from it. Here is, by every outward sign, one of the best businesses in Britain, run by some of the most conscientious men in it. There is no villain in this story of the kind an easy tale would supply, no cruel master twirling a whip, no cynic who never pretended to care. That is exactly what makes it hard, and exactly why it matters. And yet the wrong was real, and the film will not soften it into a mere misfortune. To know that your comfort rests on another's bondage, and to go on taking the comfort while you deliberate, is itself a kind of choice, made again with each morning that the ships come in. The Cadburys were careful men above all, and their care was bent, for 8 long years, as much toward the guarding of their business as toward the freeing of the enslaved. That is the charge against them, and it cannot be answered by pointing to the gardens of Bourneville, for the gardens of Bourneville are the very thing that makes the charge so grave. For the cocoa that fed this pure and philanthropic and abolitionist enterprise was, at this very moment, being grown thousands of miles away by people who had been seized in the interior of a foreign country, marched to the sea in chains, and set to labour on plantations from which they would never return. The men in Birmingham did not yet know it, or did not yet let themselves fully know it. But the knowledge was coming toward them, carried in letters and reports, and in the end, in a single sales document that no conscience could read and misunderstand. The height has been built. The pure name stands at the top of it, the family whose faith fought slavery. Now the ground begins to open. Chapter 7. A price written beside a name. In the year 1901, a plantation came up for sale, and its labourers were listed among the assets. That is where the second half of this story begins, not with an atrocity witnessed, but with a document read, a piece of ordinary commercial paper that told the truth more plainly than any speech could have done. The estate was on one of the Cocoa Islands, and it was offered for purchase in the normal way, with its acreage and its buildings and its stock all set down and valued. And there, among the assets, counted alongside the land and the trees and the tools, were the people. 200 labourers, the document said, valued at £3,555. Read that figure again, because it is the hinge of the whole film, and it will return. 200 human beings, priced as a lump, £3,555, set down in a ledger between the buildings and the crop. Whatever the law of Portugal chose to call these people, whatever fiction of free contract stood between them and the word slave, no honest reader could look at that line and fail to understand what it meant. A person you can buy with the land is a person who is owned. The man who saw that document and grasped what it said was William Adlington Cadbury, of the 3rd generation of the family, now helping to run the firm his grandfather had founded and his father and uncle had saved. He had heard the rumours already. There had been talk, in the trade and in the missionary press, of how the labour on the Portuguese islands was got, of columns of people driven from the African interior, of a traffic that wore the clothes of contract and had the substance of the old slave trade. The Anti-Slavery Society had printed accounts of slaves marched down from the interior of Angola. William Cadbury had picked up word of it through his own connections in the wider world of tropical estates. The sale document did not tell him something wholly new. It confirmed, in the cold arithmetic of a price, something he had begun to fear was true. What made the document unbearable was its ordinariness. It was a business paper, drawn up by men of business for men of business, listing plainly what a buyer would get for his money. And in the ordinary course of that business, it had set down human beings among the movable goods, as calmly as it set down the tools and the drying sheds and the trees. There was no cruelty of language in it at all, no anger and no shame. The horror was in the calm. A man could read it over his breakfast and pass it to a clerk, and nowhere on the page would anything cry out. The evil had been folded so neatly into the routine of trade that it took a conscience already awake to see it there at all. The knowledge did not stay in one man's head. It reached the board. The minutes of Cadbury Brothers for the 30th of April in the year 1901 record, in the firm's own hand, that slavery, either total or partial, existed on the cocoa estates from which it bought. That single line matters more than almost anything else in the story, because it fixes the date. From that April, The firm cannot say it did not know. Whatever was done afterward, and whatever was left undone, was done, and left in the knowledge, written into the company's own record, that the labour behind its cocoa might be slave labour. The clock that a courtroom would one day count begins to tick on that spring day in 1901. And here the story sets its cruelest problem, the problem the whole of the rest of the film will turn upon. What does a firm do with such a knowledge? The easy answer, the one that comes quickest to the modern ear, is that it stops. It stops buying that day and washes its hands. But the men of Cadbury did not do that, and the reasons they did not do it were partly self-serving and partly, it must be said, serious. And the two were tangled together so tightly that even now they are hard to pull apart. Roughly half of all the cocoa the firm bought came from those islands. To cut it off at a stroke would shake the business to its foundations, threaten the livelihoods of thousands of workers in Birmingham, and hand the market to rivals who would ask no questions at all. There was more to it than money, or so the firm argued. Britain took only a small share of the island's cocoa, a 20th of the whole, most of it going to the European continent. A refusal by one British firm, the argument ran, would change nothing on the islands themselves, since the Portuguese growers could sell all they made elsewhere. It would simply throw the labourers out of what little they had without setting a single one of them free. Better, then, to stay in the trade, to use the leverage of a great and respected buyer, and to press for reform from within, than to walk away clean and change nothing. That was the case the firm made to itself. William Cadbury even drew a distinction, which his critics would one day fling back at him, between the growing of cocoa and the mining of gold and diamonds, as though the gentleness of the crop somehow softened the nature of the labour. So the firm chose a third path, neither buying in good conscience nor stopping in good conscience, but investigating. It would find out the truth for certain. It would press the Portuguese. It would work through quiet channels to bring about reform, and in the meantime, while all of that slow work went forward, it would go on buying the cocoa. That decision, taken in 1901 and held to for the better part of a decade, is the tension at the heart of everything that follows. The firm was doing something. The something was slow, and the cocoa never stopped coming. The word printed on every tin was pure. The question now was how long a firm could keep buying what it suspected and still deserve the word. Chapter 8. The Islands at the End of the Chain. Roughly half of all the cocoa Cadbury bought came from two small Portuguese islands in the Gulf of Guinea. Their names were São Tomé and Príncipe, and most of the British families who spooned the firm's pure cocoa into a cup had never heard of either. They lie off the coast of West Central Africa, close to the equator, volcanic and green and drenched with rain, and they had belonged to Portugal for centuries, since the first age of European expansion. Their history was steeped in bondage from the start, for in their earliest days they had grown sugar with slave labour and served as a staging post in the Atlantic slave trade. When that first economy faded, the islands slept for a time. Then, in the 19th century, they found a new crop, and the crop was cocoa, and the old machinery of forced labour woke again to serve it. The land suited it almost too well. The soil was rich, the climate hot and streaming with rain, and the cocoa tree flourished as it did in few places on earth. Through the closing decades of the 19th century, the islands filled with plantations, large estates that the Portuguese called rocas, and the cocoa poured off them in a rising flood. Cadbury had begun buying from them in the year 1886, and the firm's dependence had grown with the island's output. By the year 1905, these two specks in the ocean, together, were the single largest producer of cocoa in the entire world. Not the largest in Africa, the largest anywhere. On something like 230 estates on São Tomé and around 50 more on Príncipe, a workforce numbered in the tens of thousands turned the wet hillsides into the raw material of the world's chocolate. To grasp the scale is to grasp the dependence. Cadbury's own purchases were reckoned to equal about 1/5 of everything São Tomé exported. Set the figures the other way, against the firm's own supply, and they cut deeper still, for something close to half of all the beans Cadbury bought came off those islands. The pure cocoa of the essence, the smooth new dairy milk, the whole sweet output of the garden factory, rested to the extent of 1/2 upon the produce of 2 Portuguese colonies thousands of miles away. A shock to that supply was a shock to the firm. This is the plain commercial fact that sat beneath every moral calculation the men of Birmingham would make, and it must be kept in view because it explains, though it does not excuse, a great deal of what they did and failed to do. Keep in mind, too, how young this dependence was and how fast it had grown. Cadbury had bought its first island cocoa only in the 1880s, and in the space of a single generation, that trickle had swollen until it was half the firm's supply. The rise of Bourneville and the rise of the firm's reliance on the islands had happened together, in the same years, feeding each other. The garden factory and the distant plantation had grown up as twins, and the sweetness of the one had always depended, though few in Birmingham cared to trace the line, on the labour of the other. Now, an estate is not only soil and trees. The rocas were built things, and the way they were built tells you what they were for. Each was a world to itself, a compound set down in the plantation, with its own chapel and its own hospital and its own store, ruled by a resident manager who answered to owners far away in Lisbon or in Portugal's cities. To a passing eye, a roca might have looked almost like a settlement, almost like a rough kind of village, with its ordered rows of buildings and its little church. But it was a village with a lock on it. The store was often the only place the labourers could spend what little they were paid, so that the wage flowed straight back into the owner's hand. The compound held its people in and kept the machinery of the trade turning far from any outside gaze. Set that image beside the other village, the one thousands of miles to the north. Bourneville had been built to be seen and admired, its doors thrown open, its streets walked by visitors who came to praise it. The roca was built to be closed, self-contained, and out of sight. No reformer sailed from Birmingham to study a São Tomé plantation. No photograph of one hung in an exhibition of enlightened industry. The two ends of the same chain were built on exactly opposite principles, the one for the eye of the world, the other to escape it. And the cocoa that joined them travelled from the hidden village to the famous one, and turned, along the way, into the purest chocolate in Britain. And at the heart of the roca, the thing that made the cocoa and the money both, was the workforce. Tens of thousands of men and women laboured on those hillsides, and almost none of them had come there freely, and terribly few of them would ever leave. The names of some of those estates survive today, Agua Ize and Sunday and others, standing now as ruins in the forest. But in their working years they were the engine of a fortune, and the fuel of that engine was human, brought across the water in a steady stream, because it burned away so fast. The output of those hillsides was staggering for so small a place. In their peak years, the two islands sent out cocoa by the tens of thousands of tons, enough to make them, together, the first producer in the world, ahead of every great colony and every mainland rival. A generation later, after the trade that fed them had been broken, that output would fall away to a fraction of its height, and the islands would slip back into obscurity. But in the years of this story, they stood at the very summit of the cocoa trade, and Cadbury stood among their largest customers. The truth of what the firm was buying lay at the far end of the road those beans travelled. To reach it, the story must follow the people who grew them back off the islands and along the way they had come, a road that began in the interior of Angola and ended at the edge of the sea. Chapter 9. The contract that was never meant to end. They were called contract servants, and the word was a fiction because almost none of them ever went home. In Portuguese, the name was serviçal, and it was chosen with care because Portugal had formally abolished slavery in its colonies back in the 1870s, and so the law required that these labourers be something other than slaves. They were, on paper, free people who had willingly agreed to work for a term and a wage. Every part of that description was false except the labour, and the men who went to the islands to look came back unable to find any honest word for what they had seen, except the one the law forbade. The road these people travelled began far inland, in the interior of Angola, hundreds of miles from the sea. There, by various means, they were gathered. Some were seized outright in raids, some were handed over to settle a debt, some were taken in the aftermath of local wars, sold by one power to another. However they were caught, they were then formed into columns and marched to the coast through country that broke the weak, along tracks that a journalist who followed them would call the slave path. They passed through the coastal towns, through Benguela and Catumbela and the ports of shipment, and there, before a Portuguese official, each was registered as a voluntary worker who had freely agreed to a term of 5 years. The contracts were written in Portuguese, a language the recruits could not read, and read aloud, when they were read at all, to people who had no power to refuse. A large part of the small wage was held back into a fund said to pay 1 day for the journey home. Look closely at that fund, for it is the whole fraud in miniature. A part of every labourer's wage, and a large part, was withheld by the owner and set aside, in the words of the contract, to pay for the passage back to Angola when the term was done. On paper, it was a mercy, a forced saving that would one day carry the worker home. In practice, the term was seldom allowed to end, the passage was seldom given, and the money, held by the very men who profited from the labour, was in many cases simply kept. The worker was made to save for a freedom he would never be granted, out of a wage that was already next to nothing. Every part of the system wore this doubled face, a humane form laid neatly over an inhuman fact. But the journey home was the fiction inside the fiction. In the boom years, by every account that reached Britain, the labourers were not sent back. The 5-year term would end, and it would be renewed by the stroke of a pen, or simply ignored, and the worker would stay on the island until the work or the climate ended him. Children born to the labourers on the estates were treated as belonging to the owner, born into the same condition as their parents, which is the surest mark of slavery there is. Between the year 1888 and the year 1908, something like 67,000 people were shipped from the African mainland to those 2 small islands. By the turn of the century, around 4,000 fresh labourers were being landed every single year. And the reason the islands swallowed so many new people year upon year was the plainest and most terrible fact in the whole account. The people already there were dying, faster than any free settlement could ever lose its own, so fast that only a constant stream of replacements could keep the estates at strength. Here the film must slow down and speak carefully, because this is the evidence on which the word slavery finally rests, and it is not the film's place to make a spectacle of it. The men who examined the islands recorded death rates that no free labour could explain. A figure of around 1 in 5 of the workers dying every year is the one most often cited, used both by the independent journalist who went there and in the later scholarship. A plantation doctor's own estimate put it somewhat lower, at around 12 to 14 in every 100 each year. An estimate of the deaths among the children ran as high as 1 in 4. Even on the estates spoken of as the best, the yearly toll ran above 1 in 10, and on one plantation the record showed 80 deaths among 150 newly arrived labourers. Sleeping sickness, carried by the fly, was rampant, and worst of all on Principe, which in these years was being emptied by it. These are not the film's numbers. They are the numbers gathered by the investigators, and they are set down here as those investigators set them down, with restraint and with their names attached. There was, too, the matter of Portugal itself, for the system was not a lapse that the authorities failed to notice. The state ran it. Colonial officials presided over the tribunals that turned captives into contract workers with a signature. In the year 1903, the Portuguese government issued a labour decree, presented to the world as a reform that would regulate and soften the system, but which in practice gave it a legal shape and an official administration. When the abuses were put to the Portuguese authorities, they were called trivial, and the decree was pointed to as the cure. The wrong at the root of this story was Portuguese, and that must be said plainly and kept in view. The men of Cadbury did not make the system. They were its customers. The moral question the film puts is the customer's question, and it is a question that has not gone away in the century since. What does a buyer owe, and how fast, when he comes to suspect what he is buying? It was this, the steady, structural dying under a paper called a contract, that made the honest observers reach past the legal word for the plain one. Joseph Burt, the Quaker whom Cadbury itself would send to investigate, wrote at the end of his inquiry that if this was not slavery, he knew of no word in the English language that correctly described it. The journalist Henry Nevinson wrote that, except in the eyes of the law, it made no difference whether a man was called a servicle or a slave. The contract, the wage, the fund for the journey home, all of it was paper laid over the old reality. And roughly half of that reality, measured in cocoa, was being shipped to Birmingham and turned into the purest chocolate in Britain. William Cadbury had read the price of 200 people in a sales document. This was what that price had bought. Chapter 10. 8 Years of Knowing. William Cadbury went to Lisbon in 1903 and was told the abuses were trivial and the cocoa kept coming. That sentence holds the whole of the firm's dilemma and the whole of its failure, and the years it covers must be followed slowly, because everything a courtroom would later weigh happened inside them. The firm knew, from the board minute of April 1901. What it did with that knowledge, over the 8 years that followed, is the true subject of this story, harder to judge than any single villainy, and more familiar to the modern conscience than we might wish. The first steps were real, and they were slow. In the year 1902, William Cadbury met a Scottish missionary named Matthew Stober, who had lived in the region, spoke Portuguese, and could supply first-hand testimony of what the labour system was. In March of the year 1903, Cadbury travelled with him to Lisbon to put the matter directly to the men who governed the islands. He met the planters and the officials and, at length, the Portuguese colonial minister himself. And the answer he received was the answer that power gives to an inconvenient conscience. The abuses were trivial. Such problems as existed were being addressed. There was a new labour decree, issued that very year, which would set everything right. William Cadbury came home with promises and little else, and the cocoa kept coming. In the year 1904, the firm took its next step. It wrote to the other great chocolate houses, to Fry and to Rowntree in England, and to the German firm of Stolwerk, proposing that they join together to fund an independent investigator, a man who would go to the islands and to Angola and find out, beyond dispute, what the truth was. It was a responsible thing to do. It was also, when set beside the alternative of simply ceasing to buy, a way of not yet acting, a way of turning a moral emergency into a long and careful inquiry. And so the years began to pass. 1904 became 1905, and 1905 became 1906, and the investigator learned his Portuguese and made his slow way across the islands. And in Birmingham, the pure cocoa continued to arrive by the shipload and continued to be pressed and sweetened and sold. The firm did not sit idle in those years, and fairness requires that this be said. It kept up its pressure on Lisbon. It turned to the British Foreign Office and to the Foreign Secretary himself, seeking to have diplomatic weight brought to bear on Portugal to reform the system. It gathered information and kept its own records. Behind the scenes, William Cadbury laboured at the problem with a persistence that his defenders would later point to as proof of good faith. The trouble was that all of this labour was patient, private, and slow, and that none of it interrupted the trade. The pressure was real, and the buying was also real, and the two ran on side by side, year after year, while the men who might have ended it waited for a reform that never came. The pressures that argued against a quick and public break were not all cynical, and honesty requires that they be set out fairly. Britain took only about 1/20th of the island's cocoa. A refusal by Cadbury alone, or even by all the British firms together, would leave the great European market untouched, and the trade running much as before. The Foreign Office preferred quiet diplomacy to public rupture, and asked for patience so that pressure could be brought on Portugal through the proper channels. And there was the argument, sincerely held by some, that to stop buying was not to free anyone, but only to ruin the labourers further, throwing them out of work without lifting the yoke. All of this was true, and all of it was also, conveniently, the argument for continuing to receive a supply that made up half the firm's beans and a great part of its profit. The honest and the self-serving pointed the same way, and that is the most uncomfortable fact in the whole account. Portugal itself, in these years, was in no state to reform anything. The country was sliding toward crisis, and in the February of the year 1908, its king and his heir were shot dead in the streets of Lisbon, an assassination that shook the monarchy to its foundations and left the government fighting for its own survival. A state in that condition had little attention to spare for the treatment of labourers on distant islands, and less will to enforce a reform that its powerful planters opposed. William Cadbury, pressing for change through the proper channels, was pressing on a door behind which the house was already on fire. It was one more reason the quiet diplomacy came to nothing, and one more year in which the cocoa kept coming. William Cadbury, in his own defence, would say things that his critics found damning. He said that he did not feel himself called upon to take any initial step, as though the burden lay on others. He drew that distinction between the growing of cocoa and the mining of gold or diamonds, as though the crop somehow softened the crime. Only much later would he admit, in plainer words, that the labour had been in almost every sense as bad as the old-time slavery. The film should not paint him as a monster, because he was not one. He was something more troubling and more ordinary, a decent man who could see the wrong clearly and still find, year after year, sufficient reason to wait. The knowing had begun in 1901. The acting would not come until 1909. And in the gap between them, other men, who owed the islands nothing, were already refusing to wait. Chapter 11. The Witness Who Would Not Wait. While one investigator spent 9 months learning Portuguese, a journalist walked the slave path himself and published what he saw. The two men stand for the two ways of answering a horror, and the difference between them is the difference this chapter turns on. The investigator was Joseph Burt, careful, thorough, and slow. The journalist was Henry Nevinson, and he was in a hurry because he believed that people were dying while the careful men prepared. Burt was the man Cadbury and the other firms had chosen, and he did his work in the most conscientious way imaginable. Before he sailed, he spent some 9 months learning Portuguese, so that he would need no interpreter and could not be deceived by one. Then he went, and he stayed. He spent around 2 years on the whole inquiry, roughly 6 months of it on the islands themselves, and he travelled into Angola along the very routes the labourers had walked, seeing the country and the traffic with his own eyes. He was no sensationalist and no zealot. He wanted his findings to be unanswerable, and to make them unanswerable, he took his time and weighed everything twice. When at last he wrote his report, around the year 1907, it confirmed everything the darkest accounts had claimed, and it carried the weight of a man who had seen for himself and could not be dismissed as a partisan. His conclusion that he could find no word but slavery was all the more powerful for the patience that had produced it. But patience has a cost, and the cost is time, and time on those islands was measured in lives. While Burt learned his Portuguese and crossed his 6 months of hillsides, Henry Nevinson went the other way. Sent by an American magazine, he made his own journey inland in Angola in the year 1905, following the slave path for hundreds of miles, and it nearly killed him. He fell gravely ill on the route, so ill that he came to fear he was being poisoned, and he pressed on. What he saw he wrote down without waiting for anyone's leave, and in the year 1906 he published it, first as a series of articles in the magazine and then as a book under a title that refused all comfort. He called it A Modern Slavery. The book did not spare its readers, and its images lodged in the mind. Nevinson described the bones of the dead lying along the path where they had fallen and been left, and wrote that it would take an army of sextons to bury all the poor bones. He described the shackles and the driving. He wrote that except in the eyes of the law, it made no difference whether a man was called a cervical or a slave. He wrote of the hollowness of the so-called consent, of contracts agreed to by people who could not read them and dared not refuse. And he made plain that the whole apparatus of 5-year terms and repatriation funds was a screen drawn across the old trade. Coming from a respected correspondent who had gone and seen, it was devastating, and it reached a wide public on both sides of the Atlantic. Nevinson's exposure did not stand alone. It belonged to a wider awakening, for these were the years when the conscience of Europe was being forced to look at what its comforts cost. In the same decade, the world was learning the truth of the Congo, where the rubber that Europe consumed was being wrung from the people of Central Africa under a regime of terror, exposed by campaigners and by an official British report that named the horror plainly. The cocoa story and the rubber story were of a piece, 2 halves of one lesson, that a European good upon a European table could be joined by an unbroken chain to forced labour and death in Africa. What set the cocoa story apart was its target. The rubber campaign accused a foreign king, the cocoa accused a British firm, and one that professed the highest ideals of all. And Nevinson became, in time, one of the sharpest critics of Cadbury itself. For here was the uncomfortable shape of things. A journalist with no stake in the islands had gone and seen and told the world within a year. A firm that had known since 1901, that had every resource, that professed the highest conscience, was still, years later, quietly investigating and quietly buying. To Nevinson, and to those who thought like him, the firm's careful inquiry began to look less like diligence and more like delay, a way of appearing to act while the trade went on. The very thoroughness that made Bert's report so damning also meant that it took years to produce, years in which the cocoa never stopped, and Nevinson was not inclined to grant the men of Birmingham the benefit of that doubt. By the autumn of 1908, the evidence was no longer in question and no longer private. William Cadbury himself had gone out at last, late in that year, to see the islands with his own eyes, and had found the promised reforms unapplied and the conditions much as the reports described. Bert's report, after being held back for a time at the request of the Foreign Office while diplomacy was attempted, and handed first to the Portuguese government, was released to the British public in October of that year. Nevinson's book had been in circulation for 2 years. The truth about the islands was now fully documented, fully public, and fully in the hands of the firm that had suspected it for 7 years. The time for quiet inquiry was over. What remained was the reckoning, and it would come not in the shape the firm expected, not as a slow diplomatic reform, but as a public accusation of hypocrisy printed in a London newspaper, and then as a trial. Chapter 12. The accusation the firm could not ignore. On the 26th of September 1908, a London newspaper set the white hands of Bournville against the African hands that grew the cocoa. The paper was The Standard, a conservative journal, and the article was a leader, an editorial, written by a journalist named Sidney Lowe. It did not fumble for its point. It took the whole glittering reputation of the Cadbury name, the pure cocoa and the garden village and the Quaker conscience, and it turned that reputation into the weapon of the attack. Why, the article asked in effect, did the firm's tender solicitude for the workers of Bournville not extend to the Africans who grew its cocoa? It used a phrase that went to the bone. It was not called slavery, the paper said. They named it contract labor now. But in most of its essentials, it was that monstrous trade. Here was the charge the firm could not let stand, because it was the exact inversion of everything Cadbury had built. For more than 40 years, the name had meant decency. Now a great newspaper was telling the whole reading public that the decency was a mask, that the firm which housed its English workers in gardens was knowingly living off the labour of African slaves, and had been for years. There was politics in it too. The Standard was a conservative paper, and the Cadburys were prominent liberals. George Cadbury owned a leading liberal newspaper of his own. The attack on the chocolate family was, among other things, a blow struck in a wider political war, and both sides knew it. But politics did not make the underlying facts less true, and the facts were the danger. The firm's decision to sue was therefore a gamble of the highest order. It could have let the article pass, as great concerns often let attacks pass, trusting the public's long affection to outlast a single day's headline. Instead, it chose the open field of a courtroom, where its opponent would be free to summon every document and every date, to call the years of delay by their harshest names, and to do it all before the assembled press of the nation. Cadbury believed its conduct would bear that scrutiny. It was about to discover, in the most public way an Edwardian firm could arrange, exactly how its conduct looked to 12 ordinary men who did not share its high opinion of itself. So Cadbury did the thing that would carry the matter out of the counting house and into open court. It sued the Standard for libel. It went to law to defend its good name. And in doing so, it guaranteed that every detail of the 8 years of buying would be laid out in public, under oath, and picked over by a hostile advocate. It was a bold move and a perilous one, for a libel action does not only test whether the words complained of were false, it invites the defence to prove them true, and to do so, it may range across the whole conduct of the plaintiff. by suing, Cadbury put its own 8 years on trial. And the lawsuit was not the only answer the firm made, for in the same season, it did at last the thing it had put off since 1901. In the spring of the year 1909, its own inspection of the previous autumn having convinced William Cadbury that Portugal would not, or could not, reform, and Bert's report now public and unanswerable, Cadbury brothers announced that they would buy no more cocoa from São Tomé and Príncipe. The boycott was real, and it held. Fry and Rowntree joined it, and the German firm of Stolwerk and pressure from across the Atlantic was added to it. The buying moved away from the islands and toward the Gold Coast of West Africa, where cocoa was grown by free African smallholders on their own land, and where, as it happened, the bean was reckoned to be of finer quality. Within a couple of years, the Gold Coast would be the largest cocoa producer on Earth, and the islands would begin their long decline. The switch of supply was no small thing to arrange. Half the firm's beans had come from the islands, and that gap had now to be filled from somewhere. It was filled from the Gold Coast, the British colony on the West African mainland, where cocoa came from countless African farmers working their own small plots, free men selling their own crop, a world away from the great compounds of São Tomé. Cadbury sent people out to encourage and organise that trade, and bought land there for its own purposes, and the free-grown African bean flowed north to Bourneville in place of the old. The chocolate of the century to come would be grown, in large part, by the very kind of free African labour whose absence had damned the islands, and there is a bitter justice in that, arriving as it did only after 8 years and a farthing. It would be easy to end the story there, on the boycott, and call it a conscience arriving late but arriving. That is not how the age judged it, and it is not how this film will judge it either. For the boycott came only after the accusation, only after the report was public, only after 8 years of knowing. To many who watched, it looked less like a moral awakening than like a firm cornered at last into doing what it should have done long before, and doing it now with one eye on the coming trial. Whether that judgment is fair is the very question the courtroom would put. The private moral question of 1901 had become, by the winter of 1909, a public trial in a Birmingham court, with the whole country able to read the answers. And the man who would ask the sharpest question of all was already preparing it. Chapter 13. The Victory That Was Worth a Farthing. Sir Edward Carson rose in a Birmingham court and asked William Cadbury how many slaves had died to make his cocoa. Carson was the most formidable advocate of his age, an Irish barrister of terrible skill, the man who a decade before had broken Oscar Wilde in the witness box and sent him from the court a ruined figure. He appeared here for the newspaper, for the defence. Against him, for Cadbury, stood Sir Rufus Isaacs, himself among the finest lawyers in England, a man who would rise in later years to be Lord Chief Justice and then Viceroy of India. The trial was held in Birmingham on the firm's home ground through the closing weeks of the year 1909, and it ran over the better part of a week, with the verdict coming on or about the 6th of December. Carson's strategy was quiet and deadly. He did not try to prove that the labour on the islands had been free, for everyone in the court knew it had not. He did not deny that slavery, or something no one could tell from it, had grown the cocoa. He attacked instead the delay. He set out the 8 years, from the knowledge of 1901 to the boycott of 1909, and he asked the jury to weigh what the firm had done in all that time, which was to go on buying, and to go on profiting, and to say nothing in public. And then he put to William Cadbury, in the witness box, the question that has outlived almost everything else about the case. Had he formed any estimate, Carson asked, of the number of slaves who had lost their lives in preparing his cocoa from the year 1901 to the year 1908. And William Cadbury, the good and troubled man who had known and waited, could only answer, "No, no, no." It was a devastating moment, and it went to the exact centre of the wound. The firm had built its whole worth on conscience, and here was its representative, on oath, unable to say how many had died in the years when the firm had known and had not stopped. For the defence, Isaacs made the firm's case as well as it could be made, and it was not a weak one. He argued that Cadbury had sought the truth diligently from the first, that Portuguese obstruction had dragged the inquiry out, that the firm had been steadily reducing its dependence on the island's cocoa, that the profits of those years had gone toward good and charitable purposes, and that the Foreign Office itself had counselled patience and quiet pressure rather than a public break. All of this was true, and the jury heard it, and much of it was to the firm's credit. The question before the jury was narrow. It was whether the newspaper had libelled the firm, whether it had gone beyond fair comment into falsehood, and on that narrow legal point, the jury found that it had. The verdict was for Cadbury. In law, the firm had won. The men of the jury retired, and were gone only about an hour, and came back, having found for the chocolate makers against the newspaper. For one moment, in that instant, the firm had what it had come for. The court had agreed that the newspaper's words were a libel, that they had crossed the line from fair comment into a wrong the law would punish. The good name had been defended in open court before the nation. And then the same 12 men, who had just branded the newspaper a libeller, turned to the second question that a libel action must answer, the question of the price of the wrong, and in their answer to it, they passed a second verdict upon the plaintiff, far heavier than the first. And then they came to the question of damages, the sum the newspaper must pay for the wrong it had done to the firm's good name. And they did the thing that has kept this trial alive in memory for more than a century. They awarded Cadbury brothers the sum of 1 farthing. 1 farthing. A quarter of 1 penny, the smallest coin then made in England, the coin a child might be given and think little of. It was a verdict that convicted the victor. In the language of the law, it is called contemptuous damages, and the name says everything. It is a jury's way of declaring that a wrong has indeed been done to the plaintiff, and that the plaintiff deserves, for that wrong, almost nothing at all. The firm had asked 12 ordinary men to weigh its wounded reputation against its 8 years of buying, and the 12 men had weighed the two things, and set the value of the injury at a farthing. The newspaper, though it paid that farthing, was ordered to bear the costs of the long action, a sum running into many thousands of pounds, so its defeat was real in money and heavy to carry. But the deeper defeat, everyone understood, belonged to the firm that had won. The trial had unfolded, as it happened, in the same weeks that the country was convulsed by the great struggle over the people's budget and the power of the House of Lords, and the newspapers were full of the constitutional crisis. Yet the farthing cut through the noise and lodged in the public memory, where it has stayed. A firm had gone to law to clear its name of the charge of hypocrisy, and had been handed its victory in a coin not worth the picking up. Chapter 14. What the sweetness stood on. Bourneville still makes chocolate, and on 2 islands in the Gulf of Guinea, the plantations stand empty, their chapels and hospitals falling in. That is the shape the years have left. The garden village survived and prospered, still governed by the trust that George Cadbury founded in 1900, still without a public house at its old heart, still walked and studied and admired, a pleasant place to live to this day. And São Tomé and Príncipe, once the largest producer of cocoa on earth, sank through the century into one of the smallest, its great estates crumbling back into the forest, the rocas standing now as ruins, monuments to a trade that consumed the people who worked it. On the islands, what survives is the architecture of a system, emptied of its victims. In England, what survives is the brand, cleansed by time of the memory of them. The boycott did, in the end, achieve something on the ground. After 1909, the trade began at last to be curbed, and in the years that followed, something like 14,000 labourers were returned to Angola, and repatriation, so long a fiction, began haltingly to be enforced. It came far too late for the tens of thousands who had already died on the hillsides, and the reforms were partial and slow and often evaded. But the largest and most reputable buyers had walked away, and the machine that had fed on Angola began to run down. The cocoa of the world's chocolate would come now from other ground, much of it grown by free African farmers on their own small holdings, and the name of Cadbury would travel on into the century, through a merger with its old rival Fry, and another with Schweppes, and at the last, a foreign takeover, until the independent Quaker firm of this story existed no longer, and only the wrapper remained. William Cadbury did not fall silent after the trial. In the year 1910, he published his own account of the whole affair, setting out the firm's conduct and its reasons, a careful and unrepentant defense of the years of investigation and delay. He believed to the end that he had done what a responsible man could do, that a sudden boycott would have freed no one, that the patient path of inquiry and diplomacy had been the right one, even though it had failed. There is a case in that, and it deserves a hearing. And there is the farthing, and the question in the witness box that he could not answer, and the 8 years in which the pure cocoa never stopped. Both of these things are true at once, and the film does not ask you to choose between them so much as to hold them together, which is harder. There is a reason this story reaches forward into our own time and will not stay quietly in its glass case. Every age has its distant islands, its far end of the chain where the true cost of a cheap and pleasant thing is paid by people. The buyer will never meet the garment, the metal, the very cocoa still. The Cadbury affair is the first great rehearsal of a question that has only grown louder in the century since. The question of what a company owes for the hidden links of its own supply, and how long it may plead ignorance or inquiry, or the sheer difficulty of acting, before the plea itself becomes a kind of guilt. The men of Birmingham faced that question 100 years before it had a name, and they answered it slowly, and a jury told them, in the smallest coin it could find, exactly what it thought of the delay. Return now to where this began, to the tin on the British kitchen shelf and the single word printed on it. That word was pure, and it was the truest thing about the product and the falsest thing about the trade behind it. The cocoa was pure. The chain that brought it was not. And the deepest lesson of the whole affair is not that Cadbury was uniquely wicked, for it was not, but that it was in many ways uniquely good, and that even uniquely good men, of a faith that had fought slavery and a firm that had given its village away, went on for 8 years buying what they knew, because to stop was inconvenient and uncertain and expensive, and because the dying was happening to people they would never have to see. The distance between a good name and a clean conscience is the whole subject of this story, and it is measured exactly by those 8 years. Set the two things side by side that the jury held at the last. In the one hand, the price written beside a name in a sales document, 200 human beings valued at £3,555, the plainest statement of what the trade was that anyone ever set on paper. In the other hand, the coin the jury awarded, the single farthing, the plainest statement anyone ever made of what the firm's wounded pride was worth when weighed against that price. Joseph Burt, who had gone and seen for himself, said that if this was not slavery, he knew of no word in the language that described it. A Birmingham jury, having heard it all, could not free the labourers and would not fully condemn the men who had bought their toil, and so it did the only thing left to it. It gave the purest name in Britain its victory, and it valued that victory at a farthing, and it left the country to draw its own conclusion about what the sweetness had always stood on. If this story held you, subscribe, because the histories that get told the least are often the ones that ask the most of us. And before you go, tell me where you are watching from, and tell me honestly what you make of the men of Cadbury. Were they guilty men who moved too slowly to protect their supply? Or were they decent men trapped in a wrong they could not undo fast enough? I read the replies, and I want to know where you draw that line.